Today we're talking about universals in religion or commonalities between different religious systems, something that we talked a little bit about in the context of religious syncretism when we discussed the Baha'i faith. Baha'i is maintaining that all of the great teachers of all the great religious traditions are really prophets in the mode of the Old Testament, that they are prophets attesting to the existence of one God. So not just Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship one God, but they say that Hindus and Buddhists and others from different mystical traditions are all worshiping really the one same God, and that all great religious teachers are really prophets in the biblical sense. So Baha'i was one example of a religion that is trying to distill all of the world religions, all of the different religions that get chapters in your Living Religions textbook, into a single framework. So Baha'is are talking about universal religious truth. This is a bit of a complicated topic. You can break down the different kinds of religious universalists that I'm going to talk about today into three categories. One is that of the Baha'is, others like the Theosophical Society and Unitarian Universalism, who believe that there is some truth to religion, who believe that God or universal consciousness or some principle of the divine is a feature of reality, and that the great religious traditions of the world are describing the divine in unique idiosyncratic ways, but they are fundamentally talking about the same thing, and they are talking about something that is real and deserves real recognition. They're talking about the universal truth of the great religious teachings of the great religious traditions of the world. There are, on the other hand, theorists who take a more naturalistic approach to the study of religion, saying not necessarily that God or divinity is some force external to us that we can somehow experience for ourselves, but rather that human religiosity or the tendency towards religious behaviors in human beings is something that we've either evolved or is somehow natural to our character as a species. So some people like Karen Armstrong, who's a very popular theorist of religion right now, and before her, Mircea Eliade, spoke of homo religiosus, religious man, the belief that human beings are religious by nature. So, on analogy with Homo sapiens, thinking humans, they said that religiosity is every bit as natural to our character as finding a mate or seeking out community or tool use or artistic representation. Homo religiosus on analogy with Homo sapiens. A third category of thinkers lies in the domain of the psychology of religion, or more precisely, psychoanalysis in religion, thinkers like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and to some extent also Sigmund Freud, who believe that commonalities that we can observe between different religious traditions are somehow an expression of common structures to the human mind or psyche. So these are, once again, theorists who don't necessarily believe that the mythological supernatural elements to religion reflect some sort of supersensory reality, but rather that there are universals between religions which are a consequence of the fact that the structures of our mind share certain similarities as a result of human evolution, which produces certain uniform religious images, or what Carl Jung calls religious archetypes, finding expression in different cultures, albeit in slightly different forms, but having their origins in structures of the human mind that we are all born with. The whole project of comparative religion and the necessity of comparing Christianity, Western religion, with non Western religions is in large part a product of colonial encounters with non Western cultures during the era of European colonialism. So in medieval Europe, there were some Jews and some Muslims around, but very few Europeans had any real notion of religious systems that were radically different from their own. Of course, Judaism and Islam are quite close to Christianity, historically speaking. It's not until Europeans go out and they discover these forms of religiosity, worship, and practice, and ritual and belief that are so radically different from their own that they have to start thinking more deeply about what is it that these systems of belief share with their own religion, and how are they different. This is really the birth of world religions. A more intellectually substantial approach to the comparative study of religion came out of the discovery of Sir William Jones in the early 1800s that Sanskrit and the languages of northern India were closely related to Latin, Greek, and the languages of Europe. It's out of this that the British, who are ruling in India at this time, recognized a common heritage between Europe and South Asia. And with it, the prospect of discovering more about a shared religious heritage through translating the sacred texts of Hindus and Buddhists from Sanskrit and Pali into English. There were, in these early days of the 19th century comparative study of religion, two camps, one of Jones and his disciples, who took a very hard-nosed philological approach to the study of these texts. We're going to translate these texts very carefully and see what they mean. And there were, on the other hand, groups of people who were after the sweetest plums of their research, who were after the deep questions, the deeper meaning behind the sacred books of the East. That was the translation series of Max Muller when he started translating the Vedas and the Buddhist books. He had this series of books called the Sacred Books of the East. Um, these were people who, by and large, didn't have firsthand knowledge or familiarity with the ancient languages of South Asia themselves, who were relying on English translations, but who sought within these newly translated religious texts the deepest level of commonality between Western religions, Christianity, the religions that they were familiar with. The most notable consortium of such esoteric comparativists of the late 19th century was the Theosophical Society, founded in the 1870s by a Russian heiress, Madame Helena Blavatsky, and her friend and American Army Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. The Theosophical Society had its headquarters in Madras, what's now Chennai in southern India. And the premise of Blavatsky, Olcott, and their friends was that all religious traditions, at their core or at their essence, are teaching a universal truth, what they called perennial wisdom. So, what does a perennial wisdom mean? What's the difference between a perennial and an annual plant? Um, an annual flower is one that blooms just once, and then when it dies in the fall, you have to replant it the next year. A perennial flower is one that blooms every year. Right, so it blooms every year. Like if you have a tulip, it blooms in the spring, and then when it gets cold out at the end of summer, you have to take take the bulb up and put it in the garage. But when you plant it again next spring, it will grow up again. So um, it's perennial plants flower every year. Just so, according to the Theosophical Society, the great founder figures of all of the great religious traditions of the world were teaching the same fundamental core message, just tailored to the people of the time and place that they live. So the perennial wisdom is the idea that the essence of world religions is one teaching that blooms or blossoms periodically through the teachings of great prophets and great founder figures, everyone from Zoroaster to the Old Testament prophets, to Jesus, to the Buddha, to Krishna, to the latter day prophets of people like Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, holding that if you distill their teachings down to their very essence or core, they're basically saying the same thing. And what is that same thing? Well, you understand that by necessity, if you're going to say that all of the religions of the world are saying the same thing, that thing has to be very general in its definition, which indeed the Theosophists hold a very general definition of the content of perennial wisdom. They say that the perennial wisdom is that the goal of human life is the experience of union with the supreme being, sometimes also called transcendent consciousness, infinite presence, the energy of the universe, and that this union is achieved by a process of physical and mental purification or improvement over time. So, this could be anything like the Christian prayer and daily examination of the conscious, Buddhist insight meditation, Hindu yoga, where you gradually curb the impulses and more base desires of the body. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think about this. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the Theosophical Society. It is worth noting that although the Theosophical Society became more or less defunct 100 years ago, the ideas of perennial wisdom remain influential in circles that we can broadly put under the umbrella of New Age religion. So, this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more in the last lecture of this class. But New Age religion, broadly defined, I call it the salad bar view of personal spirituality. New Age religion lets you pick the little bits that you like from every religious tradition and assemble them all to curate your own personal spiritual orientation or practice. So, although the Theosophical Society was something of a novelty of the late 19th, early 20th century, its ideas of perennial wisdom and that kind of universalism lived on in other circles until today. Coming to the mid 20th century and the birth of religious studies as an academic discipline, possibility of doing a major in religious studies or getting a PhD in the history of religions or the comparative study of religion, there were a number of scholars, very influential scholars, who tried to account for what they saw as certain commonalities, common themes, and common images between different religious traditions, including religious traditions that are separated geographically, so all throughout the world, and temporally. So some of these myths might be thousands of years older than other variations of them. And these are all kinds of things, commonalities like themes like someone getting swallowed up by a giant fish, themes like the world ending in a fiery conflagration, things like we're a certain high place at the exact geographical center of the world, what Mircea Eliade calls the axis mundi, or the axis of the world. This is something like a really tall tree or a tall mountain that serves as a conduit or connecting point between the divine world above and the world of humankind below. Examples include the Yggdrasil tree of Norse mythology, Mount Meru in Hinduism, the Bodhi tree for Buddhists, the Kaaba in Mecca for Muslims. How do we account for the appearance of images such as these in religious traditions separated by vast time and space? If you add up all of the different stories of flood myths in different religions and cultures around the world, stories relating to a great flood that only a few people survived and went on to repopulate the earth. There's something like 140 total such stories in different cultures throughout the world. How could this be the case? How can we account for this? Some people have suggested that maybe stories like the flood myths are memories of actual historical events. So at the end of the last ice age, there was in what's now the state of Montana in the northern United States this enormous lake that was held in place by glaciers. Glacial Lake Missoula, it was called. And periodically, when these glaciers would melt, this lake, which was half the volume of Lake Michigan, would just burst out and massively flood the whole area around Montana and the Dakotas. So some people have suggested that maybe flood myths are a recollection of these Stone Age glacial floods passed on from generation to generation as a part of living memory. That's one way that we could possibly account for some of these things. Other people have suggested that commonalities between myths might be the result of diffusion. So perhaps myths were transmitted by word of mouth from one people to another. Perhaps myths which had some germ of truth or some historical basis were told first by one group of people, then transmitted to another group of people by word of mouth, tailored over time to different cultures in which the same story was retold, resulting in a large number of versions of the same myths with local variations. Some, however, found the attempts to account for similar images across different religious traditions through diffusion or through the spread of stories to be inadequate. Carl Jung famously noticed some of the images that appeared in religions across the world in the dreams of some of his schizophrenic patients. These were images such as the equilateral cross, the Ouroboros, or the snake eating its tail, the mandala, or radiating geometric pattern, and also characters such as the wise old man, the trickster or the court jester, the anti-authoritarian figure who is there to break the rules, outwit the king, and openly mock authority, and the universal mother figure or goddess of the earth. Jung drew several conclusions from the fact that he found such similar imagery in his patients' dreams and in religious art and scripture. In the case of the more obscure images that his patients, he reasoned, would never have come in contact with from ancient or esoteric religious traditions in their daily lives, implied that rather than having learned somehow firsthand about these images, archetypes such as these must be the product of the human subconscious mind. Jung, like Freud, believed that the mind was divided into the conscious and subconscious, conscious life of which we're all aware, and then the subconscious, which for Freud and Jung consists of formative experiences from childhood that we've since forgotten. But Jung adds another third category to this, what he calls the collective unconscious. So this is a form of subconscious that, rather than being unique to each person based on our forgotten childhood experiences, is universal to all people and is a product of our evolution, is a function of the structures of the human mind that we are pre-programmed with as a product of our evolutionary biology. For Jung, the collective unconscious, the part of our minds universal, shared by all people, is the storehouse of archetypal images. This was Jung's first realization, and the second realization was that the archetypes seem to appear in the dreams of his patients at crucial junctures in their lives, and in fact could function as a kind of diagnostic into a patient's progress towards mental well-being or a sense of psychic wholeness. So the equilateral cross, Jung understood to be a sign of stability. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, is a universal symbol of the circle of life. So even though we're all mortal and we're going to die, still we have babies and we reproduce, so the cycle of life continues. The mandala was the most profound archetype for Jung. Mandalas can figure importantly in Tibetan Buddhist artwork, as we talked about last week. And Jung believed that the mandala symbolized psychic wholeness, the dissolution of the ego, and represented a very promising sign, such that when his patients started dreaming about them, Jung knew that they were on the mend, so to speak, psychologically. Jung's patients seem to have intense periods of dreaming during major life transitions, during puberty and middle age, and towards the end of life. The trickster, who represents independence from authority, might appear if someone is debating leaving their boring job, their stiff stuffed suit 9-to-5 job, and pursuing their passions, taking up that career that they chickened out on after college of being an artist or a comic or a musician. The wise old man, who represents the gatekeeper and the guide into uncharted territory, might appear when someone is considering taking an adventurous detour, like running off with their friend to take a 6-month motorcycle tour through South America. The best way I can liken it to is to say that archetypes are like memes hardwired deep into our brains, which Jung thought were actually useful and necessary to achieving. Jung thought that we had evolved these archetypes as a kind of guide, natural guide through the stages of life from childhood to old age. And that by listening to our dreams as a psychoanalyst, decoding the meaning and significance of the archetypes that appear there, one could stay on track in terms of psychological well being. The way that Jung thought about this in terms of biological evolution was to say that it makes sense if we have pre-programmed, hardwired into our mind the idea when we're a baby, when we don't know anything, when we can't talk, when we haven't experienced anything, we have some hardwired idea of a woman who is going to supply all of our emotional and physical needs. How does a baby know to cuddle up to their mother and to breastfeed? Jung reasons it's because they have the archetypal image, not a specific image of their mother, but rather the archetypal image of a a mother who is there to support them in every way. Just so Jung realized it makes sense if we have from a very young age a pre-programmed idea of a father figure. For Jung, this is a more disciplinarian and severe figure, but nonetheless essential to human development from a very young age. Later on in life, around the time of puberty, there is the activation of the anima in men, a man's idea of a perfect woman, and the animus in women, a woman's archetypal notion of a perfect man. It's it's the anima and animus archetypes that Jung thinks enables us to fall in love. So we meet a person who is a highly specific, a specific individual, but the act of falling in love, according to Jung, is the superimposition of our hardwired concept of, this is the perfect person, right? Onto this real life man or woman that we meet, such that we see them in an maximally idealized fashion. So when you fall in love with someone at first, they can do no wrong, and you don't see any of their faults. They're just so completely perfect. Jung thinks that it's the hardwired idea of a perfect man or a woman, the archetype of the anima or the animus, that enables romantic life at a young age. And there's much longer story to be told here. Probably the anima animus the most are the archetypes that Jung is known most famous for. So it starts off as the stage of pure idealization, but Jung says that we progress through our adult life to see our partner in more realistic terms, that there are 4 stages of the anima and the animus, and that people who have a successful lifelong romantic relationship eventually get past the phase of a pure idealization to come to accept their partner as a real human being with virtues and vices, assets and flaws. To explain the idea of pre-programmed archetypes on the basis of the experiments of one of Jung's disciples, Anthony Stevens. Stevens performed a series of experiments wherein he tested the reaction of a bunch of newborn baby chicks to the shadow of a hawk. So he had this cutout paper hawk that he would fly over the chicks so they saw the shadow on the ground to see what they would do. And the result of this experiment was that from the time they were just a few days old, and with no prompting from the mother hen, so the mother hen is out of the picture, the chicks, when they saw the shadow of the hawk on the ground, would instinctively go run and hide. So Stevens bred captive chickens indoors for several generations to test what each new generation of chicks would do when they were exposed to the shadow of the hawk. And sure enough, in each case, the little chicks having never seen a real hawk before and having had no instruction from older chickens, would run and hide when they saw the shadow of the hawk. So, this for Stevens was proof of the idea of a kind of archetype, the archetype of hawk shadow that is hardwired in the brains of these baby chicks. And for him, was proof that it was at least possible that Jung's theory of unconscious archetypes in human beings could be true. Jung parts way with Freud because Freud sees the unconscious as individual to each person, built up through the traumas of childhood and the source of complexes and neuroses that are essentially adversarial in nature. So for Freud, the whole project of psychoanalysis is trying to dig down into our repressed memories to figure out this terrible stuff that happened to us in childhood so that we can confront it as adults. Jung, on the other hand, saw the subconscious as complementary to an individual's psychic development. And the collective unconscious indeed is something that's there to guide us through the stages of life. Because he thought that the guidelines for healthy psychic development were basically pre programmed in us, Jung had a highly idealized view of uh, traditional cultures in which people treated their dreams as having oracular significance and as a guide to life decisions, telling people when to get married, when to prepare for death, and so forth. Jung thought that this capacity to listen to our dreams, which were really an expression of the guide to life outlined by the collective unconsciousness and the archetypes it contained, had become ignored in the busy life of industrial modernity. So here Jung, in his, I think this was Man and His Symbols was his last book. He says that primitive man was much more governed by his instincts than are his rational modern descendants who have learned to control themselves. In this civilizing process, we have increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis, that somatic means located in the body, the somatic basis of the psychic phenomenon. So Jung was really kind of a romanticist who wanted to return. Jung thought that in traditional cultures that people didn't have the kind of mental health crises that we do now. Actually, he thought that things like anxiety and depression were not at all widespread or endemic as they are now. People knew how to deal with negative feelings by listening to the directives of their collective unconscious. How does all of this relate to religion? Well, Jung, along with Freud, we talked about Freud a little bit in class already. I'm not going to rehearse Freud again today, but both of them thought that the insights of analytical psychology were present in ancient mythology. Jung's view of religion was that in organized religion, in the great religions of the world, all of them, we find reflections of the archetypes of the collective unconscious in all different sorts of ways. Freud's view of religion was at the end of the day negative. Freud thinks that the neurotic elements of the human psyche, the desire to kill one's father and marry one's mother, are expressed in organized religion. And because Freud thinks that the subconscious is something that has to be conquered or subdued, he also has, by extension, he also has a very negative opinion of religion. Jung, on the other hand, believed that through the Jung, on the other hand, believed that because organized religion contains and expresses archetypes of the collective unconscious, that we find a universal message across religious traditions, which is directing people towards a greater degree of psychological health. For Jung, if we psychoanalyze what religions are all about, if we decode the archetypal image that they are constructed from, we get an across the board teaching about the necessity of the gradual reduction of the ego, self centeredness, or the personal quest for wealth, power, and fame, which Jung says archetypal imagery is always steering us away from. Contrasted with the ego for Jung is the self, and God is the archetype of the self for Jung, actually. Whereas the ego makes one's self-worth dependent on the opinions of others, an integrated self or personal psyche is inward looking and depends upon one making life choices that are congruent with the demands of archetypal imagery as they present themselves in one's dreams. And it's through listening to our dreams and the admonitions of the archetypes as they arrive that we can achieve what Jung calls psychic unity, the integration of the self and the dissolution of the ego. And Jung sees this kind of psychoanalytic dimension to religious imagery all over the place. He was, of course, interested in Western religions, Christianity and Judaism, but he was also deeply interested in Eastern religions. And he would give this whole series of lectures on Kundalini Yoga or Tantric Yoga, which he saw as all about the symbolism of personal psychic development. So, in this kind of yoga, I think we talked about it a little bit in class. There is the idea that there are these chakras, these 7 chakras that go up the base of the spine all the way to the top of the head, and that the yogi awakens this tiny little serpent, this 3-inch long serpent called the Kundalini that's in the coccyx or the base of the spine, and that through successive yogic practice, the little serpent climbs at the base of the spine and activates these nerve centers, these chakras. And for Jung, the symbolic significance of activation of successive chakras mirrors the successive development of stages of psychological development. So at the base chakra, this is just infant consciousness of wanting food and physical comfort. The second chakra is all about sexual satisfaction. The third chakra is the will to power chakra that's about conquering others. And then finally, when we get to the chakra of the heart, the Anahata chakra, we're into the realm of compassion and caring about others, on up to the more spiritual chakras, the last of which is when you know no distinction between oneself and others. So this is basically enlightenment from the point of view of tantric yoga. But for Jung, this is the highest possible stage of psychological development, one which most people never get to, by the way, according to Jung. The idea that God is somehow a projection of our own psyche is, of course, difficult from the point of view of traditional Christian theology, where there's a necessary distinction between God and humankind. Jung's ideas remain especially influential, however, within New Age religion and forms of spirituality which are more open to Eastern religion, because rather than a necessary distinction between human and divine or God and mankind, in Hinduism and Buddhism, we get ideas such as the unity of the individual soul, the Atman, with Brahman, the oversoul, or the Hindu idea that Shakti, female energy, is an animating principle of the natural world. So there's this theological idea in Hinduism, which is resonant with Jung's notion that every man contains his archetype of the perfect woman, the anima, and without it, romantic attachment wouldn't really be possible. Joseph Campbell is another famous religious universalist and another hero of the New Age religious movement. Campbell was concerned predominantly with one archetypal figure in Jung's catalog of characters, that of the hero, which Campbell saw as configuring centrally in all of the great religious myths of all the different traditions in the world, and also in all great world literature, from Gilgamesh to Homer's Odyssey to the Grail romances of King Arthur. Campbell took to be allegories for the quest for religious transcendence. Campbell saw in all great religious stories, the biographies of the founder figures of the great religions, from the Buddha to Krishna to Zoroaster, a single template for how the narratives of these stories worked. He calls this the monomyth, or the hero's journey. And the way this works, according to Campbell, is that in all of these stories, these great works of literature and these biographies of religious heroes, so to speak, you have someone who's living an otherwise ordinary life, Siddhartha in the palace, Luke Skywalker at his aunt and uncle's farm on Tatooine, and one day something comes along to interrupt their otherwise mundane and humdrum existence. This is what Campbell calls the call to adventure. And it very often involves the appearance of another archetype. So Jung's archetypes are sprinkled throughout the hero's journey. It usually involves the arrival of the wise old man. And this is the beginning of the story proper, or the adventure proper, the crossing the threshold. And for Campbell, the way that ordinary great works of literature, which don't present themselves as having religious significance, take part in the same narrative format that explicitly religious stories do, is that from the time that the hero leaves their ordinary life until they return home at the end, they go through some kind of personal transformation. There are all the plot points necessary to any epic story: defeating the bad guy, recapturing the princess, discovering the treasure, what have you. There's also, Campbell says, the inner transformation that the hero undergoes over the course of these events. Often, Campbell says, some sort of discovery about their identity that completely changes their perception of themselves, and sometimes, too, a kind of death and rebirth in the second act of the story. And this can be a literal death and resurrection, or it can be a kind of symbolic death and rebirth, after which the hero is wholly transformed as a person. Joseph Campbell was personal friends with George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, and Lucas credits Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, his book where he lays out the monomyth theory, as having been a major inspiration for first three Star Wars films. So the first Star Wars trilogy is a pretty good illustration of the monomyth. Luke Skywalker lives a provincial life on his aunt and uncle's moisture farm that spends his days dreaming of travel and adventure, until one day these mysterious robots come with a message from a princess and take him to the wise old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi, after which they go on a quest to save the princess. The crossing of the threshold, Campbell identifies as the Mos Eisley cantina scene, where Luke is, suddenly he's in the big city that he's never been in before, and he sees all these cast of characters and realizes that he's not in Kansas anymore. So this is the crossing of the threshold, the beginning of the adventure proper, during which Luke meets other archetypal figures. The roadman, or the one who has already gone through their own adventure and their own transformation and already has found the holy grail of knowledge for themselves that the hero is after. The second act of Star Wars is The Empire Strikes Back. Luke undergoes he discovers this earth-shattering thing about himself. What is that? Well, it's the spoiler alert. It's that Darth Vader is his father. It's a very Taoist message in Star Wars right here, a very yin and yang. There's the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force, but they're complementary. Neither can exist without the other. And even the light side contains a bit of the dark within it, right? And of course, Darth Vader, Luke's father, is able to redeem himself. His yang is reinfused with yin at the very end of the Return of the Jedi, the third film. Luke's own symbolic death and rebirth takes place between the end of the second movie and the beginning of the third movie. Luke loses his hand, almost dies, becomes partly mechanized like his father, but emerges in the third film, in the third act, as a certified Jedi. And the gift of the goddess, the Holy Grail, the resolution to the adventure is the restoration of the Jedi Order, the defeat of the Empire, and everybody lives happily ever after. Campbell is famous for his monomyth story format that strings many of the archetypes of Jung's catalog together, but also for his theory about the way that myth functions in society. Campbell thought that every society requires a dominant myth which structures its social relations and informs moral decision-making and inspires artistic production. So a dominant myth in Hindu society might be the Ramayana. In Buddhist society, it might be the life and ministry of Siddhartha, the Buddha. In Christian society, it's the life and ministry of Christ.
But Campbell has kind of a functionalist idea of myth as something that is necessary to teach people about morality and the requirements of civic life and the requirements for how they're supposed to act in society. Campbell thought that if a dominant myth were to recede or be lost in any given society, the result would be a general form of social anomie or alienation or aimless nihilism among the people in that society. And several years after Campbell came out, he gave this now famous series of interviews with Bill Moyers, aired on PBS, when Moyers asked him about Star Wars, and Campbell says, "Well, I think that this is a myth for a technological age." So, in a society where the mythology of conventional religion has fallen out of fashion, the world has been disenchanted, as Max Weber says. Star Wars he sees as a kind of substitute myth of an imaginary technological future that still contains the same lessons and precepts as any traditional religious myth. So on the one hand, myths teach people about morality and social duty. A prime example for Campbell is the myth of King Minos, who was given a bull by Poseidon, but rather than sacrifice it, he takes it home, and his wife ends up having a baby with the bull, and they have the Minotaur, half man, half bull child that has to be dealt with and put in the maze and everything. And for Campbell, this is exemplary of a morally instructive myth. In Greek society, a king has to act selflessly. He has to do what's right for his state and his people. And if he lets his own ego get involved, so keeping the bull for himself as a trophy rather than sacrificing it as he promised, all kinds of terrible complications are going to result. Campbell also, like Jung, had a romantic idea of pre-civilizational peoples, observing that life rituals or rituals associated with transformations from one phase to the next, usually birth, puberty, marriage, and death, precisely the stages in life where Carl Jung says that archetypes can figure so importantly. Campbell identifies as involving forms of symbolic death and the symbolic acquisition of the powers of gods and goddesses. So Campbell emphasizes that in many pre-civilizational societies, when a boy becomes a man during their teenage years, during puberty, or a girl becomes a woman, there are, quote, severe exercises of severance whereby the mind is radically cut away from attitudes, attachments, and life patterns of the stage left behind. This follows an interval of more or less extended retirement, during which are enacted rituals designed to introduce the life adventurer to the forms and proper feelings of his newest state, so that when at last the time has ripened for his return to the normal world, the initiate will be as good as reborn. Campbell then sees lived myth and the hero's journey as essential to directing people through life stages in pre-civilizational societies. You know that you've become a man, or you know that you've become a woman because you have died to your previous prepubescent self and been formally initiated into this new stage of life. Like Carl Jung, Campbell also believed that pre-civilizational people had higher incidence of mental health difficulties because through lived myth, each person knows their place in society in accordance with their age and their social station, and aren't left with the same anxieties and fear of unfulfillment that we now are in modern society. So, like Carl Jung, Campbell was something of a romanticist about pre-modernity and pre-civilizational peoples as well. The thing that Campbell got most famous for was his mantra to follow your bliss, saying that all of us receive the call to adventure at some point within our own lives. That is, the whole experience of the hero's journey of going on this adventure, discovering some fantastic truth about your identity through introspection, and becoming a transformed person out of it is something that Campbell says we can all experience. He says that the wise old man, or some form of the archetypal embodiment of the character opening the door to another realm, a new set of experiences that you've never had before, happens to everybody. This is what makes Campbell very appealing among New Age religion enthusiasts, and is what made him most famous after he died in 1988. So Campbell says if your friend calls you up graduation week after college and asks you if you want to take an unplanned 6-month motorcycle tour through South America, that you should say do it. And Campbell says that you should always say yes to the adventure, because it's only through proceeding through the trials of the unknown that you are ever going to come to know yourself, that you are ever going to have that transformation yourself. And the massive appeal of Campbell, especially in the baby boomer generation, was to say that this story cycle, this template, which serves as the formula for great epic literature, which is the narrative template for the biographies of great religious figures, is also something that is available to all of us. And this is the source of Campbell's mass appeal, especially in New Age spiritualism. I won't say a whole lot about Unitarian Universalism, but if there is one church or organization that we can characterize as institutional New Age religion, it's really Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalists believe that all religions offer a path towards happiness and salvation. So if you go to a Unitarian Universalist service, I went to one time in Madison, Wisconsin, and they will read the Bible, but they also might read from the Bhagavad Gita or a Buddhist text. At the one service that I went to, they sang a Cat Stevens song as a hymn. And Unitarian Universalists let you pick as a teenager. You go to like Unitarian Universalist summer camp, and you're allowed to pick your own devotional path based on any of the religions that you've studied in church up to that point. You're allowed to come up with your own daily regimen for prayer. And this customized personal spirituality is yours and yours alone. You are your own supervisor in terms of whether you're going to follow it or not. And there's no restrictions on what you're required to believe theologically or even in terms of the afterlife. So some Unitarian Universalists say that they're just after happiness and contentment in the current world, that they don't know what happens after the afterlife. Some Unitarian Universalists say that they believe in reincarnation. Some say that they believe in heaven. But there is no internal doctrine within the church, which is, of course, a very loose organization, standardizing theology or requirements of belief. So you can see also why Campbell's mantra to follow your bliss, to pursue the call to adventure by pursuing whatever kind of activity it is that makes you feel most contented and whole and at peace with yourself, that becomes a kind of spiritual trajectory resonant with New Age spirituality and people who want to draw from the broadest possible palette of forms of spiritualism, religious practice, and belief.